And we are live. Welcome to this Friday stream on the World Anvil channel. Today we're going to be talking about modernizing myths with Abigail Owen, author of The Games Gods Play. And I am going to be bringing her up here in just a second. So you guys know the drill at this point. I'm not Janet. We're going to be flying by the seat of our pants for this one, but I think it's going to be fun. So here we go. Hello, Abigail.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to chat with you about this.
We're excited to have you. I'm going to introduce you because you are much too modest to introduce yourself. Abigail Owen is an award-winning author who writes new adult and young adult romantasy and paranormal romance. She is obsessed with big words, fast plots, couples that spark, a dash of snark, and oodles of HEAs. Other titles include Wife, Mother, Star Wars Geek, Ex-Competitive Skydiver, ADHD, Spreadsheet Lover, Jeopardy Fanatic, Organizational Guru, True Classic Movie Buff, Linguophile, Wishful World Traveler, and Chocoholic. Abigail currently resides in Austin, Texas with her swoon-worthy hero. They're mostly angelic teenagers and two adorable fur babies. So welcome to the show, Abigail Owen.
Thank you so much.
So today we're going to be talking about the wild world of mythic fantasy and bringing ancient myths, specifically ancient Greek myths, into the modern era, which is something that you've done in your book, The Games Gods Play. And I apologize if I trip over that because there's a lot of G's and S's in that.
There is. Yeah, I didn't think about when I picked that title, the how it's going to be a little bit of a tongue twister.
It is a little bit. So, okay. Let's dive right into what is the appeal for you for retelling ancient myths? Like what drew you into this particular format for storytelling?
Space. So I've always done this a little bit, both with myths and with like fairy tales, old fairy tales. To me, I love those stories from the way they're gritty, the way they are. They can be really dark. I like the worlds that they're set in and the characters that they display. And so taking something familiar and then putting a new spin on it, to me, that's playtime. That's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and like you're right that like I think there's a lot of overlap between myths and fairy tales. I mean, arguably Beauty and the Beast is a retelling of Psyche and Eros, so like there's definitely a lot of connective tissue between fairy tale retellings and myth retellings. So what have you found has been like the biggest challenge with retelling myths?
So
in a modern context, I guess.
The modern context actually, honestly, gives me a little bit more room to play because I'm not setting it in an ancient space where you're going to stick much more stringently to the, the known mythos, essentially. Whereas, if I'm setting it modern, this is a world where currently Greek gods aren't worshipped. They don't walk the world. And so being able to set that means I'm already rewriting the history to a certain extent. So it actually gives me quite a bit of, like I said, kind of creative leeway. I knew the Greek gods very well before I went into this. It's something that I've been obsessed with since Clash of the Titans in the 80s. But I did really enjoy the research for it. My world building tends to be very as where the story takes me type world building. And so, I research as needed more than anything. So trying to stay true to the myths that people know while still taking a different lean toward it, I would say was the bigger challenge. Like, what do I stick with and what do I break, essentially? I try to give a lot of nudges, like Hades frequently tells the main character, Lyra, like, humans get it wrong all the time. I will say that the nice thing in the Greek mythology space is that is actually, it's not that we get it wrong, it's that we don't know, because so much of it happened before the written word. Some of it, a lot of it was, we don't know who actually wrote this information or who came up with this, where it was passed down. So much of it was just passed down over time. And so that also gives me a little bit of wiggle room, if you could say. But yeah, trying to stay true to the mythology while taking the story in a completely new space it was a fun challenge, though.
That's neat. And it also really segues nicely into my next question, which is what changes are needed to make ancient myths resonate with modern audiences? How do you take these very old stories and make them feel fresh and modern?
Well, I think part of that is that they already do resonate with modern audiences, or we wouldn't all be so familiar with the Greek gods in the first place, and so interested in them. So there's that part to it. And if you look at just like, say, Clash of the Titans, which, was its own interpretation of Greek mythology, you get the hero aspect, you get the monsters aspect, you get the gods throwing around their weight aspect, you get, Medusa, who's one of my very favorite, characters in Greek myth, and kind of her tragedy aspect of it. You get the romance aspect of it. You get the saving the princess. Like, there's so much to that story, or those stories that I think already appeal to modern audiences, just the adventure, the romance, that, the heroism, etc. So that makes it a little easier. I think setting it modern also helps a lot, because we're reimagining things like Zeus has a temple on what is currently the Marin Headlands across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco, right? And so you can kind of picture a temple right there on that big old hill. And so for me, that's the fun part, is like, okay, what would they do with cell phones? What would Greek gods do with cell phones? Like, how do you incorporate those elements? What would they wear? It gives them, because we always only picture Greek gods in their, traditional Greek dresses and togas, essentially. I find that at least in the modern space, they had more to wear.
Yeah, isn't everybody always just wearing these long white drapey robes with, breeches and things like that?
Exactly. So yeah, let's mix it up a little bit.
That's really nice. And I guess the other side of that question is, what modern things were the most fun to kind of pull into this mythic space? And like cell phones sounds like a thing that's obviously kind of interesting in fashion. So I can imagine each of the different gods has probably a very different take on fashion and technology and things.
Yeah, and they'll still bring in their, kind of ancient, like they all have armor that is very much tailored to them, that's old looking, it's ancient armor. So they get to kind of bounce back and forth in that, sometimes they're reflecting their more ancient natures, and sometimes they're reflecting, the more modern world. The cell phones was fun, just the fact that like Hades can text Asclepius, and I've never pronounced that right, but Asclepius, to come heal, Lyra. And then he just pops in and it's like, okay, I'm here, let's heal. But it was sent through a text. So yeah, that part was fun. It also, I will say, the modern technology can also be like why didn't they just look it up on the internet? Why didn't they just, bring a gun to the fight instead of their god powers? Like, you have to kind of work around that.
Yeah, I imagine that's really challenging from like a world building perspective of like providing limitations for these kind of limitless beings, so that you don't like remove all of the potential conflict and risk from the story.
Exactly. If they can just snap their fingers and fix everything, then why did we have the story in the first place? Yeah. So that's a little harder, but fun.
Yeah, but I mean, these stories are very, very resonant. I've seen some buzz recently for a new series, I think, with Jeff Goldblum as Zeus.
I've seen the trailers for that. It looks really good. It looks dark.
It does look dark, and
yeah.
Zeus is wearing a tracksuit. Like, I buy Jeff Goldblum as Zeus. Yep. I have a harder time buying Zeus in a tracksuit. So
I don't know. I can totally, especially with Jeff Goldblum's, like the way he, like, I don't know,
embodies.
The way he uses his body. I can totally see it. Like, I can see him pulling that off. To me, they can wear just about anything. And I think one of the fun things is to see them in things that you wouldn't expect. So like, you would expect to see Aphrodite in super sultry, cleavage bearing outfits. All right, let's put her in PJs. Like, go, show them being real.
I really want to see Aphrodite in fluffy bunny slippers now. That sounds like, having a casual day, as you do when you're a god. Okay, so let's move on to my next question, which is, how can retelling myths in different cultural contexts add richness to a story? Like, how does the whole become more than the sum of its parts when you're combining the ancient and the modern?
I tried to really picture how, because if you think about it, Greek gods, what was a religion? People worshipped these beings, right? And if they're still here in the modern world, what would that look like? And to me, it would look like, I think, most other religions look like. You would go to a temple to pray, but it might look different from how we go to a temple or a church to pray, because the way they worship Greek gods was very different. So to me, that's part of it, is pulling in those elements. I also thought about, like, okay, if it's been around now for thousands of years and our world has really flattened in terms of technology, allows us to really connect with people from all across the globe differently than from, in ancient times when you were kind of limited to your physical sphere of area. So people, to me, all across the globe would worship the Greek gods. Not all people, because there's all sorts of pantheons in my world, at least. So that brings in other cultures and other, people from other countries and people from other backgrounds and perspectives, just as part of the champions. So when the gods select their champions for the games that they are going to play, the trials, they come from all over the world. And so you get very different perspectives on and approaches to those trials.
That's a really good point, and also something that comes up a lot in tabletop role-playing games. That is another part of our audience segment here. Is we got a lot of dungeon masters, a lot of game masters in our audience.
Yay, dungeon masters.
Because world building. And
that
is the question of how do religions and pantheons and faith change in a world where the gods walk the earth, where, like, you don't have to take it on faith, because a cleric is a class, because you can see them there. You can see that there's evidence that they exist. So how did you handle that in the world building for your book?
I tried to make it where it was just a natural part of life. And I think that's what I try to do with all my world building. It's just, what would if this was natural and not coming into a world where we don't know it, like we don't, what would that look like, where it was just part of your day to day? It's just part of your day to day to go to the temple on the way to work. It's just part of your day to day to mention, please, Aphrodite, help me find love. Right. Like, incorporating it, I think, just more how we are used to things in our own lives. That's what I aim for, which means that for me, rather than it being major sections of the book or like lots of telling it's more brushstrokes of, like, here's just a small moment, because it's a natural moment of when somebody might reach out in that way.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to check the chat for any questions. I do want to say that, like, Strixline says, I love Hadestown's take on the myth and the modern elements they weave into the production. So, again, coming back to the idea that, like, these myths are forever relevant and forever resonate with audiences in multiple different media forms, whether that's a book or a musical or a Netflix series, etc. So I think also, Secondhand would like to know, are the new Greek gods into esports?
I could see them absolutely being in esports. They already like their games and trials, right? So anything where you've got a competition element going on, I think the Greek gods would be there for it.
Yeah, anything they can bet on or compete with each other on.
Exactly. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. So now
some more than others I could see. So especially in esports, I'm trying to think of, like, which god would be the most into esports.
I feel like Hermes.
Hermes is where I was going in my head too. Yeah.
Like, he almost wouldn't be allowed to participate because he's got such a hand in that, like, he'd have the advantage on the scale.
Aries maybe a little bit, just
Okay. Valentine has also mentioned that I have not played much on Stay Gods, but it is a gods in modern day fic, and one that Aphrodite let herself go. I don't know exactly what let herself goes. Maybe she's just is just hanging out in her PJs all the time with her fluffy bunny slippers. That's and also Marina here says, now we need a bonus story with the gods in esports. God, so, like, seriously.
Yeah, I've got to put a scene maybe in book 2 where they're playing games and going at it. That would be really fun. And I excuse me, Aphrodite is, so I'm getting over my COVID. They now have me on steroids, but it means that I cough when I talk, so I apologize for the coughing. It's very frustrating.
That is why you have me, not Janet, today.
Oh. Yes, it's very contagious right now. But Aphrodite is actually one of my favorites, because I think that the way I've got her in my book is she actually writes herself off as, like, I've got kind of a lame power. Like, nobody takes love seriously as a power. And so, I've never won one of the Crucible rounds. I've never, really been all that competitive in that space. And, all my God and goddess brethren and sisters don't like take me seriously. And it's like, actually, if you think about it, love might be the most powerful of all of those powers, because love can break people and build them up, and love can start wars and end them. And, so there's a lot of ways you can go with that. So, she's always been one of my faves.
I love that. And it's also such a relatable character thing, because the whole idea of like the pretty sister who doesn't compete in the, the math competition or the sports competition, because that's not my role. I'm the pretty one, so that's all I get to do. So
Yep.
I think a lot of people find that relatable. Or if you're the smart one or the, the sporty one, you don't want to
that's not all you are. People are rarely just one thing, and that's cool.
Yeah. It's yet another thing that makes these ancient myths a little bit more relatable. So moving on to our next question. Which of the ancient Greek myths are the most appealing to you? Everybody has their favorite myth.
So I probably leaned the ones that are most tragic, because I am also a romance writer in my heart. Like, I'm fantasy and romance, right? And so I want to go rewrite them with a happy ever after in them instead. So like Medusa is one of those. Absolutely. She's always been one of my favorites, because that's just, if you look at it from her point of view, that's a tragic story where basically she didn't ask to be, raped essentially, and she didn't ask to be then cursed for what was not her fault. And then now she's like turning everybody around her to stone. I'd be pretty bitter too. So Medusa definitely needs a happy ever after. Narcissus and Echo, that always seemed like a very tragic story to me, with kind of how they end up. And absolutely Eros and Psyche, like that one. I was just in the Louvre this summer. We did a family vacation. We've been saving for like 17 years for this vacation, and saw the Echo and Psyche famous statue, and it was just heartbreaking and so beautiful. And yeah, so those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, I think Eros and Psyche is very popular. Echo and Narcissus. It's for me an underappreciated myth that is a dynamic that is so common in modern day relationships.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much richness there and so much to mind there, particularly in romance or fantasy romance, romantasy, etc. But like so many fewer people are familiar with that myth compared to some of the other, myths. I think a lot of the YA stuff that's going on now owes a big debt of gratitude to Arachne.
Yep.
The whole idea of female competence being punished
Yep.
by the gods seems very on point there. So I
Although,
think,
what's funny, my mom she's an ex-English teacher, and she has a book club. And so when it's her turn to host the book club, she makes them read like deep literature. And so they just did the Odyssey again. And she was like, she had noted a spot in there where one of the characters notes that the gods have a lot more fun than the goddesses. And she was like, I think this might have been like ancient feminism right here. And I was like, I've, never noticed that. And so, but yeah, when you think about it, there's a little more freedom there for the gods and the goddesses.
Yeah, definitely. And it's hard to say whether it's interpretation or if it's in the original source material, whether there's that skew of, there's kind of an unkind skew towards a lot of the goddesses that isn't necessarily there for the gods,
Yeah. And of course we're looking at it with modern eyes from a very ancient world. But I just thought that was interesting that that's a pretty ancient text. So like that would have that in there at all was just interesting. Little side note.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. Is there an ancient, I'm going to flip it from the favorites, the ones that get used a lot, etc. The popular, sorry, I almost went straight into Wicked there for a moment. Is there an ancient Greek myth you think wouldn't work for a retelling?
I don't think so, because the nice thing about retellings is that you can respin it. So to me, that's the limit is your imagination more than it is the myth itself. So for instance, like for mine, Hades is the hero, but Persephone is actually not the heroine. I love a good Hades and Persephone retelling, don't get me wrong, but I wanted to give him a completely different love story. One maybe where he's not forcing her in the relationship. Which I think most of the Hades and Persephone retellings do eventually go down that path where it's like, yeah, this is more of a, it puts him, I think, in a more positive light. But to me, it was like, yeah, let's try something completely different in that space. And so with retellings, there's so many different ways you can go, and how closely you stick to that source material is, again, totally up to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's less sorry, brain stuttered out for a moment there. The mores and the social values and things like that have changed since ancient times and do make it so that sometimes you have to lean into the adaptation part of adapting a retelling, a myth. Mm-hmm. But there probably are some myths where just the
basic story,
there's not a lot to hang our modern hats on that, like, but maybe not. Maybe human life hasn't really changed in the fundamental way
all that much. Well, and I will say that, at least for me, if I'm not going to tell a whole story around it, I like to incorporate elements into a story. So it might just be part of a scene, that story, and the way I'm going to retell it. It might just be part of like this arc, that goes through half the book, and then that part is told. And I do the same thing with fairy tales, actually. So Narcissus and Echo, I've got in my Dominion series, the very last book is coming out in November, and the opening scene is basically Narcissus and Echo as side characters that they encounter. And so I think there's other ways that you don't, like, if it's not necessarily good for like a whole huge long saga, there's ways you can still play.
Yeah, you can kind of throw that in as like a little side quest or a little sidebar. That's exactly. A really great point. Coming back to the chat, I think Secondhand Samurai said, "Is Pandora's Box the most famous one?" It's hard to say what the most famous Greek myth would be.
It is, well, and especially because when you add in like people who haven't necessarily read the Greek myths but have seen them in Percy Jackson, have seen them in Clash of the Titans, have seen them in both the original and the remake, in the various kind of visual media out there, and the games, Hades and Ares and God of War, those like I think feed into people's perceptions of the various stories. Pandora's Box, I think, is very famous. That's definitely true. I would put that up there with Medusa, probably as very recognizable Greek mythology. And then there's all the gods themselves, right? So like a lot of people might know Zeus very well, but they don't necessarily know every story that he was involved in.
Yeah. Andy also mentioned Heracles or Hercules is very famous because Disney. And that's another thing is like to the point that you made about like the visual representation. Some people actually knowing that the source of this is Greek myth, because some of things have been adapted to the point where
you don't necessarily know. Yeah,
you don't necessarily connect it to the original source material. So Bonnie Juju has commented that Oedipus might not work so well.
There you go. That's one that's in like
this day and age.
Yeah. Although when you think about most of the Greek gods, they were pretty incestuous. So like Persephone was Hades' niece, which is another reason why I was like, maybe a different love story. Although if you go into the Game of Thrones space, like you're going to see it again in a way that works oddly. Like, so I don't know.
And even more modern than that, Poe had a lot of like kind of like you can get up into there's a lot of much more modern and contemporary media that touches on similar difficult subject matter and things like that. So I think even Oedipus is probably adaptable for the right person in the right way. So okay. Tillers is reminding us that there was in fact a whole TV series about Hercules. So and then there was a much better one about Xena, who's not actually a Greek myth, but
still was a fantastic show.
It still was an outstanding show. And the 90s were just a good time for cheesy quality mythic
Oh yeah,
based
shows all
stuff.
over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So gonna go back to our questions. How can authors approach retelling myths without cultural appropriation? Because this could be a kind of a sensitive subject for people, and it's something that gets a lot of discussion in author spaces and writer spaces about how do you take something that's like a foundational part of someone's culture, someone's background and heritage, and adapt it without feeling like you're, making a mistake,
So I'll be honest and say I don't think I actually have a great answer for this, because it is such a difficult and kind of fine line that you're walking. I felt more comfortable doing it with Greek gods because they feel like, because of the way that they have been, I guess perpetuated is a good word, throughout, our stelling. Most people are very familiar with them. It's been kind of absorbed into the
sort of greater Western culture.
General Western culture, exactly. Something that we're taught in schools, something that we are, very familiar with, both from readings and but also, all the media that's out there in that space. So that, and they're not still worshipped. And so that gave me a little more, I guess, confidence to go into that space. But I did consider, it was like, okay, I'm not Greek. So can I go into this versus, like, I think I would be much more hesitant to take on like Egyptian mythology, which I think is just fascinating and rich and so interesting. But I'm not Egyptian, clearly, and those aren't as well known. So I would like to see those come from somebody who grew up with that in the culture, you know, in various different ways. To a certain extent, same with the Norse mythology. Now, I might bring them in again in brushstrokes, because in my world, I wanted the Greek gods to not be the only gods. And so the world is like our world today. You have lots of different faiths to select from, essentially. And so, the Norse gods are real, the Egyptian gods are real, the so on and so forth. The Celtic gods are real. Celtic. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it.
I feel like it's a hard C.
Yeah, it's a
I feel like it's Celtic. Yeah.
So I try to do it more in brush strokes, like I said, where it's like acknowledge that those exist, or like, for instance, the axes that Lyra eventually gets are they're the axes actually from the book cover, and you'll notice that they have Norse on them, Norse kind of iconography, and it's because they were a gift from Odin to the oldest son of Kronos and Rhea. So that's why Hades had those axes in the first place, and that's why it's got kind of a Norse leaning on them. So I try to do it in that way, where it's like, let's just touch on it. But yeah, because it's such a, I would love to see stories from people, like I said, who are from those cultures, but at the same time, I would love for writers to feel the freedom to be able to write what they're being inspired by and interested in, and bring, really cool stories to life.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I live in the Southwest. I live in Arizona, and we have like so many indigenous cultures here that have such a rich mythology and things like that. And it's so fascinating to me, and I'm surrounded by it constantly. But I feel like I can't in good conscience step into that space. I mean, I could acknowledge it as, like you were talking about, as being kind of on the periphery or involved, but like you said, in brushstrokes, but I wouldn't ever choose to make that the focus of a piece that I was working on. And I want to see more, but I want to see more from the people that's a part of their culture. And you were talking about Egyptian mythology. I think I loved Moon Knight. It was probably one of my favorite Disney Plus series.
Yep.
I thought Oscar Isaac did an amazing acting job, aside from everything else. But I saw online someone was saying that the girl equivalent, the teenage girl equivalent of the Roman Empire is the Egyptian mythology phase. That like the teenage girls always go through either an Egyptian mythology phase or a Greek mythology phase, or both, on their path to maturity. So I think that's maybe pretty resonant.
Yeah, I was about to say that might be true. Mine was clearly the Greek side, but I actually had a very good friend who was seriously into Egyptian mythology. So yeah, I can't argue with it.
Okay, cool. And I had this as an audience ticker, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it in here now because it's relevant. Which pantheon would win in a fight?
Oh my gosh, that's so hard. That's so hard. Oh, so interestingly, when I first started writing this book, initially, I had considered doing a full unique world, like high fantasy world, based on the Greek gods. But when I started trying to put together the gods, I actually pulled from several different mythologies, Norse and Egyptian, etc., because I wanted to spread out the powers a little bit. Particularly in the goddesses, there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of like fertility and motherhood and, you know, home and hearth and that kind of stuff. And so it was like, let's add a few more powers in here, basically. And what I found was that at least across the mythologies that I looked at, they were pretty similar in terms of there's usually a god of death. There's usually a god of the sun. There's usually a god of, you know, so of war. There's usually, there's a pretty consistent setup with a few
consistent
different
portfolios across all of the different pantheons.
Exactly. So then it comes down to, for me, between the gods, I guess who's going to play dirtier?
Well, that's a question you can't really answer
Yeah.
In the abstract, you can't really say who's going to fight dirty. So
exactly. But it'd be fun to see.
It really would. Okay. So moving on to our next question. We are blazing through my questions, by the way.
Oh, okay.
I'm a little over caffeinated today, so I'm like, so anyways, what are some common mistakes when retelling old myths to a modern audience? So from your perspective, what are some unforced errors that you see other authors making?
That's actually a really good question. I'm trying to think of if there's anything out there where I'm like, ooh, that maybe not that. But for the most part, I can't think of any regular mistakes I see in that space. I would say suggestions that I would have personally would be to not assume that everybody knows the mythology. Who these gods are, even the big ones. You know, I've already, my book is just out in ARCs at this point, so it's only getting in advanced reviews, but I've already seen several people be like, I know nothing about the Greek gods. And so, you know, they're coming into it with completely fresh eyes. So don't assume that they know. Go at the world building as if you're actually building a completely new world from scratch. And so I think that probably is the biggest help. And then, you know, don't forget the modern elements, especially if like that's probably one of the harder things for me is like, I'll be off in like ancient Greek world and be like, oh yeah, they do have computers. Like, oh, whoops. Like maybe I should have a moment here where I acknowledge the modern.
And I think there's a lot of empty space. I think there's a lot of leeway when you're adapting these, like you said, just the nature of retelling itself in adaptation. I feel like it covers a lot of sins because you can just say, well, in this version,
yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a really good point that you can't assume that everybody is as familiar as you are, especially if people who tend to write adaptations of fairy tales or myths tend to be deeply, deeply familiar, and they tend to have read widely different versions of that fairy tale and myth. So they understand in a very nuanced way that people who just maybe only saw the Disney version don't have. So I feel like that's actually, a really good point for like an area where mistakes could happen or things could come off and not hit right, not sound right. And I guess the best advice for avoiding that is to read widely, to make sure that you're not just pulling from one version of a particular myth or story.
Absolutely. Even the ones that I was very familiar with, I would go see what various different versions were out there to see how that myth was told in kind of different ways in different spaces, not retellings, but the original myths. Because again, especially with the Greek myths, because they are so ancient that we don't know for sure what was passed on, who said what. Like there's apparently, again, back to my mom reading the Odyssey, there's arguments that Odyssey and Iliad weren't both necessarily written by the same person, even though we attribute them to the same person at the moment. So like there's open question marks, I think, around a lot of the ancient stuff. But if you know those things, that helps a lot. I also found it helpful to look at multiple different sources for the things that especially the things I didn't know so well. So for instance, I have a bar in Olympus that's Dionysus's bar, of course, but the barkeep is Lethe, the goddess of oblivion.
Oh, that makes sense.
And so, trying to look up, because like, believe it or not, there's not a goddess and god for everything out there. So like, there's actually, while there's a god of death, there's not really a god or goddess of life out there. Like, you could make some arguments for a few of them that they do cover that, but there's actually not there's not an equal and opposite for every single thing that they have powers over. So yeah, I was like, okay, who would be fun to be a barkeep in a bar? Like, so that looks, I think I had several different options for that one.
So like maybe forgetfulness, or
Exactly. Yeah.
That does kind of make sense. So moving on to our next question. I will say, how far away can a retelling get from the original before it's no longer a retelling? Like, how much distance can you get before the thread breaks between the original and the adaptation?
That's a really, really good question. To me, as long as there's elements in there that stay true to it, because like we're getting into like, is fanfic, like fanfic, there's areas, where it's like, this was based on whatever, Twilight. And until you actually know that, you don't actually associate, okay, now I can maybe see the connections to Twilight, but I didn't see it originally because I didn't know that. To me, as long as that's what was in the back of the author's mind when they were writing it, the thread is still there. And I think the fun part as an author is to see what you can do with it that's different. And so not breaking it without breaking it, but that's the world building is it's the fun part, right? Like, you really get to let your imagination run. And so I would rather get further away from the original to let my imagination run than I would try to stick so closely to it. That's just my preference.
Yeah. And I know you talked earlier about like some of the more difficult, the heavier myths, retelling them so that they have a lighter ending, a happier ending, and more hopeful direction than the original. And some people might argue that like that fundamentally changes it and makes it not what it originally was. But I think there's definitely room to disagree about that. I think that like people have been retelling stories forever, since they've been telling stories in the first place, and it's part of the part of human nature to go, I could tell a better version of this story. This story is great, other than this one thing I want to fix.
So to me, it's not a better or worse version of a story. It's that was so inspiring, but what if this? And I think that's partly why multiverses and timeline changes are so appealing to a lot of people, is because it's an imagination of like, even making small changes. Like, you think about your life and it's like, if I hadn't gone to this school, I wouldn't have met this person, then I wouldn't have been introduced to my husband, right? So what would my life look like if that changed? So to me, it's more of a what if than it is one is better than the other. It's just what if this happened, and how would the story end then?
Yeah, and what if it's such a great springboard for creative brainstorming and for creative iteration off of something?
Absolutely.
And these stories are very sturdy scaffolding to start from with that springboard. They've been around forever. They've been retold millions and millions of times.
Well, and there's tons of psychological, research into why certain stories really appeal to kind of just universally, like the Beauty and the Beast story. For instance, like that's got a universal appeal that just about, especially in the romance space, anybody who says Beauty and the Beast, most romance readers go, me, I'm there. And so there's something in the psyche with, I think, a lot of these stories that is just kind of a universal appeal. So why not lean into that? You're right. There's definitely the sturdy scaffolding there.
Awesome. Okay, so we
As
have come down.
Said, it becomes an homage versus a retelling. Exactly. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to pull that up because that's worth displaying. So I'm going to pull it back down now because we have reached the end of my. Except for one, we have reached the end of my prepared questions, and we haven't really got any additional questions from the audience, but I did want to ask you, what is up next for you, Abigail?
So right now I'm writing book 2 in the Games Gods Play series. At the moment, it's supposed to be a trilogy. It's such a big world that might expand. We'll see, or I'll do spinoffs, one or the other, because I'm having way too much fun with this world. But I say that about all my worlds. So the world building is by far one of my very favorite things to do as an author. So I'm working on that. My Inferno Rising Dragon Shifters series, they're just recovering. So books 1 and 2 are out. Books 3 and 4 come out in December with the new covers. My Dominions high fantasy series that's based on a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, actually, about a man who sheds his shadow and the shadow becomes real and kills him and takes over his life. And that I was like, there's my villain and my hero in the same guy. So that series, the very last book in the trilogy, comes out in November. So I've got several series that are wrapping up here. And then after I finish book 2 for the Games Gods Play series, the Crucible series is what it's called. I have a couple different places I could go. Obviously, I can start straight into book 3, but I usually like to wait until my editor and I have kind of solidified the book before I move into the next book. So I have lots of other ideas floating around in my head.
Wow, it sounds like you've got a lot of stuff, really cool stuff in the works.
Oh, it's so much fun. I love what I do.
You also mentioned earlier that the Games Gods Play is currently with ARC readers. So when is that going to be like available for people? Is it available for pre-order now? Can people get their grubby little paws on it?
It's coming September 3rd, so about a week and a half. And I'm so
wow,
so excited. And this is one that's really fun for me because it's getting all the kind of bells and whistles. So it's got like the sprayed edges and the end paper artwork and, kind of I'll show you. I have a copy. Oh. So that's going to fall over probably. So you can
that's beautiful.
See, it's got like the 3D.
It's so shiny
with the sprayed edges.
Very nice.
And then it's just so pretty. That's Olympus.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
Artwork.
We love art in the World Anvil community. Like we deeply love art. So that's an important part.
I like to see the pictures of like what was in my head come to life. It's just amazing.
Yep. That's very, very cool. Well, thank you so much, Abigail, for being with us today. Tiller says, bought. Marina says, so beautiful, so beautiful. And Bonnie Juju's like, grabby hands. So I think you found a pretty receptive audience in the world.
Yeah, I hope you all love it.
So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for giving such great answers to our questions. Thank you for being patient with me, the less experienced interviewer of our team. I also wanted to let you know we've got somebody who says this whole talk has inspired me.
Oh, and thank you. Oh, good.
That is really why we do these streams, is because we are all about promoting creativity and world builders for science fiction and fantasy writers, for game masters, for people who just like spinning up their own world and setting just for the sake of doing it. So anytime we can bring on somebody like you who can like really inspire people to like take ideas and run with them as fast as they can to World Anvil and set up your free account. But we just have to slide that promotion in there. But Uncle Creepy says, thank you so much, Abigail.
Well, and thank you so much. You were a great interviewer. This was a really fun chat. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, me too. Thank you so much
for having me on.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm going to try and move over here to the help. Yeah, I've got stuff. I've got issues. Anyways, guys in the chat, you know better than I do what you got to do. Grab your hammer and go world build. Bye.